Well, I think we should get started. We have an exciting morning planned, and welcome everyone. My name is Tegan Hoffman, and I'm the Executive Director of Coastal Quest. I'll be one of the facilitators for the webinar today, along with my colleague, Tina Lee. And I'd like to welcome you all this morning to the Achieving Coastal 30 by 30 webinar series. Before we begin, I have a couple of announcements to make. First, this conference is being recorded. Coastal Quest may use this video footage recorded during the conference for educational or promotional purposes, and the recording of the conference will be available for viewing following the conference on the Coastal Quest website. Second, this conference is being translated live in Spanish, and to access the live translation, click the closed caption and translation button at the bottom of your Zoom application and select Spanish. You can also choose closed captions as well. Third, after each panel presentation, we will have a Q&A session with the panelists. We've turned off the chat comments for the conference, but we encourage all attendees to ask questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom application, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can. So let's get started today, as we have an amazing lineup of speakers focusing on U.S. approaches and priorities to multi-benefit coastal 30 by 30. So a little bit more about our three-part webinar series, where we're going to hear from leaders and start a discussion about what are and do multi-benefit coastal 30 by 30 projects and solutions look like, and how do you frame them for different types of coastal funding opportunities. We're also in this three-part series going to hear what are public and private donors focusing on in terms of their priorities for coastal 30 by 30, and how is coastal 30 by 30 being funded, implemented, and achieved at different scales, locally, regionally, state scale, nationally, and globally. And we'll hear from many different leaders in the field. We have the first session today is Explore Coastal 30 by 30 Solutions, and then we have a second on Friday about the funding priorities, and a third where we'll hear from our community leaders of case studies sharing their experiences. So thank you again for joining us for our first webinar in the series, Explore Coastal 30 by 30. And if you have not registered yet for Friday and Monday, please do so. I think Sadie is going to put in the chat the link to do that. Okay, well, before we get started, would love to hear from you and hear where you're joining us from. So let's launch a poll and find out where you're all based. Looks like we almost have everyone's filled it out. And we do have, wow, someone's close to the Arctic. Welcome. Southern Ocean, Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico. We have a couple from Indian Ocean, but a strong majority from the Pacific Ocean. I think we can maybe end the poll and share the results. Well, welcome everyone near and far. So now we can really dive into our webinar today. And today our objectives are to really learn about national and state coastal 30 by 30 multi-benefit priorities and tools. We're also going to learn and understand what do coastal 30 by 30 projects accomplish, and how are they achieving multiple benefits. What are those benefits? And we'll also talk about how is 30 by 30 being achieved at different scales in coastal regions, states, and locally. Our agenda Today is first, I'm going to share a little bit about Coastal Quest and our Coastal 30 by 30 initiative. And then we're going to hear from our first panel from NOAA and California Ocean Protection Council about national and state coastal 30 by 30 priorities. We'll then have time for question and answer. Then we'll hear from 4 speakers leading innovative multi-benefit coastal 30 by 30 projects from across the country. Specifically, we'll hear about a network of national estuarine research reserve sites in 6 states working together to plan and restore and adapt to wetland migration due to climate change. We'll hear about a watershed ridge to reef large-scale effort in Hawaii to restore and manage that watershed. We're going to hear about piloting data support tools for nomination process of water quality protected areas in California, and a case study in Puerto Rico of community-based sand dune restoration and education. Then we'll briefly talk about some next steps and opportunities for future engagement on this topic. So for those of you who don't know Coastal Quest is a service-oriented nonprofit that works with communities and governments to build more resilient coasts by inclusive science-based planning, helping strengthen governance, support financing and project implementation for a just, prosperous, and sustainable future. We provide fiscal sponsorship services to support community-based organizations, collaboratives and their projects, early leaders, and government partners. I wanted to share a bit of background about our Coastal 30 by 30 initiative and how we got to where we are today. It started in 2021 when Coastal Quest hosted with the University of California, Irvine, a virtual Coastal 30 by 30 conference, and we had over 2,700 people attending over this 2-day conference. All of those participants were interested in learning about Coastal 30 by 30, and what we realized is that there was really a need for ongoing support to engage on this topic, and we set out to investigate how to do that most effectively. And since 2021, the movement has been growing with a focus to restore, connect, and conserve 30% of lands and waters by 2030. As many of you might know, Biden administration has adopted 30 by 30 through the America the Beautiful initiative. Multiple states have issued executive orders for state 30 by 30 goals. And there's been a massive new public funding sources available to fund 30 by 30 projects, as well as related projects in achieving multiple benefits, earmarked through funding from the America the Beautiful, as well as infrastructure dollars. Private philanthropy funding is also being put forth for 30 by 30 efforts, but there isn't really a focus on the coast or nexus of offshore and freshwater land-sea connections. Yet 40% of us in the world are living within 100 kilometers of the coast. So we really see an opportunity targeting coastal ecosystems and developing multi-benefit coastal 30 by 30 solutions that link land and ocean efforts, focusing on land-sea connections and critical coastal ecosystems such as watersheds, bays, wetlands, dunes, and rocky intertidal. And the funding is mirroring some of these silos, making it challenging to finance coastal 30 by 30 projects focused on the coast, unless you're really making the case for the multiple benefits and access this blended funding. And there are multiple benefits. So when we say multi-benefit, we're saying biodiversity protection, clean water, increase access to nature, improve public health, livelihoods and strong economies, food security and sovereignty, climate mitigation, adaptation and resilience, and cultural significance. So as I mentioned, we had this incredibly well-attended conference in 2021. And so what we decided to do in 2022 is because so many people from that conference reached out to us to learn more about coastal 30 by 30 solutions, we decided to ask some of those attendees a few questions so we could design our programs to better serve their needs. And I'm going to share a little bit of those results. We had 179 coastal practitioners that we surveyed, and then we conducted some in-depth interviews with 21 representative leaders of groups to better identify priorities and trends to guide, design, and deliver support to create and achieve multi-benefit coastal 30 by 30 goals. The survey interview top responses included: first, securing and managing funding. Second was understanding coastal 30 by 30 and how their work contributes to coastal 30 by 30 goals, and identifying their own local goals and plans for achieving coastal 30 by 30. Our results show that there was a clear need for funding, support, and technical kind of assistance to support that funding and fundraising, helping manage funds, offer physical sponsorship, and developing funding plans, as well as support with coordination, collaboration, and project planning. And lastly, developing a community of practice around 30 by 30 to share lessons and case studies and tools and trading expertise and networking with other practitioners. And so that was our key findings. And based on that, we've been piloting. This webinar is a part of that pilot and launching the initiative this year to address these 3 areas and provide these services. And so our initiative is really focusing on coastal regions and those multi-benefit 30 by 30 solutions, where we're going to be working in support of projects and partnerships benefiting people, nature, and climate, and supporting partners and ally organizations and projects benefiting priority communities. So thank you for those who filled out the survey and spoke with us. We heard you, and based on the survey, you wanted to hear and learn about government priorities and also examples of multi-benefit coastal 30 by 30 solutions and projects. And so we designed today's webinar around that goal. So I'm going to now launch our first panel. Really pleased and thrilled to have our first speaker, Lauren Wenzel, Director of NOAA's Marine Protected Area Center, speak first with us about NOAA's engagement in America the Beautiful and 30 by 30 and how NOAA is supporting 30 by 30 projects in the coastal zone. And then we'll hear from Michael Esgro, Senior Biodiversity Program Manager and Tribal Liaison from the California Ocean Protection Council, where he will talk about OPC's role in coastal management, restoration MPA network, and OPC's engagement in 30 by 30 and America the Beautiful and some of their priorities as well. So I will now turn it over to you, Lauren, to share your screen.
Okay, thank you, Tegan. It's great to be here with you all today. And I'm just going to share my screen here.
Oh, Lauren, you're on mute. Sorry, there.
All right, am I off
There
mute
we go.
now?
Yes.
Okay. All right, and you're seeing my screen, so
yep,
it should be all
perfect.
All right, I wanted to start by just saying that 30% gets a lot of attention. It is a great, useful target in terms of galvanizing people to work toward conservation and giving us a target to work from in terms of 30% coverage by 2030. But that's really the headline and not the full story. And so that's what I wanted to talk about a little bit here. America the Beautiful is an interagency effort that came out of the first executive order that President Biden signed a week after he came into office on the climate emergency, recognizing the links between land and water conservation and climate resilience. And it was really aimed to address 3 things: the loss of nature, the need for climate resilience, and inequitable access to nature. And so some of the questions that we're asking are, how can we improve our conservation outcomes? And while there's a lot of attention given to new areas, we also want to think about existing managed areas and how we can improve outcomes in those areas. How can we leverage our conservation investments, including coordination among different kinds of area-based management? And how can we engage more people in conservation? So there's a lot of different activities going on. You may have heard about the American Conservation and Stewardship Atlas. So this is the tool that is going to be launched to track how much of US lands and waters are currently conserved and restored, and how our progress is going over time. We also have agency-specific conservation action plans that lay out for each agency their priorities and actions in the 6 focus areas, and then annual progress reports. And there's a public website, I can put it in the chat a little later, where you can find all the latest information from NOAA on these types of reports. So the Atlas aims to be a comprehensive and accessible picture of conservation and restoration work in America. And it's really intended to reflect conservation as a continuum, meaning that we're not only talking about areas that are highly protected or areas that are highly accessible, but we're really looking at the whole range of conservation goals and how different areas can contribute to those goals. And this is being designed and was really going to reflect a lot of public comments and tribal consultation that's been held over the past couple of years. NOAA has a lot of existing authorities that we're using to address America the Beautiful goals: the National Marine Sanctuaries Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act, Magnuson-Stevens, which governs fishery management in federal waters, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, Endangered Species Act, and also the Antiquities Act, which is used to establish marine monuments and monuments on land as well. So 2 of the areas where NOAA is pretty active are to address America the Beautiful are expanding the National Marine Sanctuary System and the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. The sanctuary system is managed by NOAA. These are often in cooperation with the state and in some cases with tribal or indigenous groups. And there's a system of 15 marine protected areas, very diverse ecosystems, diverse communities. Some are far offshore, others come right up to the coastline and address that land-water connection that Tegan was mentioning. And then the other system is the National Estuarine Research Reserves, which I understand you're going to be hearing more about later this morning. It's a system of reserves in America's estuaries that are designed for research, conservation, and stewardship and education. So just to give you a little bit more detail, there are current efforts underway to look at designation of new national marine sanctuaries on the West Coast, as Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary, in the Great Lakes with Lake Ontario, which is focused on cultural resources or historic shipwrecks, Hudson Canyon off the East Coast, which focuses on deep water canyons that have a lot of unique natural and cultural values, and also Papahanaumokuakea, which is currently a national marine monument that is being considered for sanctuary designation. And so there's a lot of activities going on in these sites, including engaging stakeholders. In some cases, we've established pre-designation advisory councils to provide ongoing input into how these areas should be designated, and also looking at new governance structures with indigenous peoples, which is something fairly new for NOAA, taking a look at how can we more proactively work with indigenous peoples to fully engage them in the governance of these areas, not only through government to government consultation, but through other kinds of structures like foundations or advisory boards. And then look, in all cases, identifying options for boundaries and management actions. And then the National Estuarine Research Reserve System is looking at potential new sites in several areas, including Louisiana, Lake Michigan, and the US Virgin Islands. And these sites are managed in cooperation with states through the Coastal Zone Management Act. And these are designation processes that are led by the states working closely with NOAA. So another topic I would just wanted to touch on is that the US government under the US Global Change Research Program is conducting the first national nature assessment. So this will answer the question, like, what is the state of biodiversity in the United States? It's a question we can't answer very well right now, especially in marine and coastal waters. And so through this assessment, we will be able to talk about the status, trends, and projections of lands, waters, wildlife, biodiversity, and ecosystems. And we intend to have the first draft of the assessment done in 2026. And there is a public comment period open right now to ask the public for input on what they would like to see in this first nature assessment and how they would like to see it be able to be used. I mentioned access to nature being a major part of America the Beautiful. We know that communities of color and low-income communities have less access to clean water, clean air, and nature and all the benefits that it provides. And so the agencies have come together and signed a memorandum of understanding on nature-deprived communities. And some of the actions they're going to be taking are to define and identify nature-deprived communities and take specific actions to increase access to nature and its benefits, and to better collaborate across the federal family to deliver those benefits, including public health and safety, and support for community leaders, and building local support. So I think that's very much in line with the kinds of goals that Tegan was talking about earlier in terms of support for 30 by 30 and the multi-benefits that it can provide. I also wanted to mention that NOAA is standing up a Marine and Coastal Area-Based Management Advisory Committee. So this will be a long-term mechanism to ensure that we're getting input from all different kinds of perspectives on how we can do a better job with area-based management. So that might include marine protected areas, coastal protected areas, fishery management areas, other types of area-based management that deliver conservation benefits, but could be better coordinated and connected. And so finally, I just wanted to mention that there are a lot of tools out there on the NOAA websites and elsewhere that local organizations can use to help inform your projects and help strengthen them. Several of these are focused around climate. We've recently launched an MPA climate change resilience and adaptation tool, and also a climate vulnerability assessment guide, how to take these steps to look at what are the climate threats to a particular area and how can it be addressed, perhaps through your project. The US Climate Resilience Toolkit. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature has published a lot of great guidance on protected areas, including on marine connectivity. So that's an area that we know we need to do a better job of connecting coastal and marine areas and looking at scientific guidance to do that. And then I also just wanted to mention NOAA Fisheries, which has published an equity and environmental justice strategy in draft that has a lot of great information about working with all different types of communities to ensure that they are getting the kinds of benefits from our programs here at NOAA. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions when we get to that point. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Lauren. Super interesting and useful information and links. Next, we will have Michael Esgro speak. So Michael, if you want to share your screen, great. And we'll turn your camera on and unmute yourself, please. Great.
All right. Thanks so much, Tegan. And thanks, Lauren. I think really cool to hear about the federal effort before we launch here into the state effort. So yeah, my name is Mike Esgro. I am the Senior Biodiversity Program Manager and Tribal Liaison at the California Ocean Protection Council. And I'm really excited today to be talking to, looks like about 150 folks from all over the country, all over the world, based on that poll earlier about our effort to conserve 30% of California's coastal waters by 2030. So let's go ahead and get into it. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Ocean Protection Council, we are essentially the California governor's advisor on coastal and ocean policy. We're nested within the California Natural Resources Agency. And really our mission is to protect the coast and ocean for future generations. So we work a lot with our sister agencies that have regulatory authority: Fish and Game Commission, California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And all of our work is driven by a strategic plan that has 4 key goal areas that you can see over here: climate, equity, biodiversity, and the blue economy. 30 by 30 sort of touches on all of those goals, but really it's focused for us on mostly on goal 3, biodiversity. So I think most of you know, and Tegan kind of mentioned this in her introductory remarks, that in 2020, Governor Newsom issued an executive order on nature-based solutions that really had 3 main objectives. So first of all was to fight climate change, protect biodiversity, and then expand access to nature for all Californians. So part of that executive order included a commitment. California was the first state in the United States to commit to this target. And Lauren, I got to tease you a little bit because I think we predated the Biden executive order by just a bit there. So we committed to this global 30 by 30 target, which has since been adopted actually back in December in Montreal at the UN Biodiversity Conference as a global movement. So really excited about that. But the question was, how do you actually implement that? How do you go about conserving 30% of lands and waters, especially in a state as big and as diverse as California? So the California Natural Resources Agency, OPC is nested within the Resources Agency, puts together this document, Pathways to 30 by 30, really as a result of over a year of very extensive public outreach, hearing from folks what's important to you in terms of biodiversity conservation, what places, what habitats, what species, what access and sustainable use is important to preserve. And the final document really, I think, is a very impressive bottom-up kind of grassroots strategy that's really focused on regional conservation, that's really focused on goals that are important to local communities. It's not a top-down document. It's not a top-down directive. It's about how do we all work together to get this done. But it does set some objective benchmarks. So really importantly, it defines conservation for the purposes of 30 by 30. And I want to spend a little bit of time on this definition because there's 2 really important elements. So first of all, I'm just going to read it out loud. I know it's on the slide. Land and coastal water areas that are durably protected and managed to sustain functional ecosystems, both intact and restored, and the diversity of life that they support. So durability is the first element of the definition, and manage to sustain biodiversity is the second element. So to count, quote unquote, for 30 by 30, an area, coastal waters or on land, has to meet both of those elements of the definition. So how much is already conserved? On land, the state made the determination that, and this is getting a little bit weedy, but basically there are these protected area codes, they're called GAP codes, and anything that had a GAP 1 or 2 code was consistent with that definition of conservation. And that translates into about 24% of California's lands. In the water, looking at both of those elements, or in the ocean, I should say, looking at both elements of that definition of conservation, we said, really, right now, only California's Marine Protected Area Network can we be like absolutely certain meets that definition of conservation. So that's 16% of California's state waters. And I'll note here that the decadal management review, the first ever decadal management review of the MPA network, is currently in process. And so that's really going to help us with adaptive management of the MPAs moving forward. But I think it's really important to say upfront, we're taking a conservationist rather than a preservationist approach to 30 by 30. And we recognize that these fully and highly protected MPAs, these coastal MPAs that cover 16% of our state waters, they're a really important component of how we're going to get to 30 by 30. But those kinds of MPAs aren't the only way to achieve conservation in the ocean. So we view this as an opportunity to kind of say, what else can we get done? We want to strengthen conservation. We want to work with federal partners to strengthen conservation in our 4 federally managed national marine sanctuaries. These sanctuaries do a lot to protect biodiversity, and we want to work with federal managers to say, how can they do more? Maybe that's kelp restoration. Maybe that's mandatory or voluntary vessel speed reductions to help protect whales. Maybe that is focusing on the land-sea connection and thinking about water quality. So there's a lot of opportunities in those sanctuaries. We want to drill down, take a threat-based approach, and really think about what can we do to really protect biodiversity in those areas. We also really want to make sure that we're supporting and elevating tribal stewardship. Lauren touched on this too at the federal level as part of our state's 30 by 30 initiative. So tribal stewardship, indigenous traditional knowledge, really, really essential to getting this done. And so we're exploring a new pathway, something brand new in the state, thinking about designating certain areas in tribal ancestral territories as indigenous marine stewardship areas. There's more detail on this in the Pathways document, but right now, to be very candid, it's just sort of an idea. And we need to explore this further with our tribal partners through consultation. So we're very much at the beginning of that process. And we'll be talking to tribes more about, hey, there's this idea that's in the Pathways document. What should it mean in practice? And how do we use this to help respond to what tribes' needs are in the coast and ocean? And lastly, we want to talk about, again, kind of a weedy term, but OECMs, other effective conservation measures. This is a term that's used at the global level to mean areas that aren't formal marine protected areas. They're established for some other reason. Maybe it is a water quality protection area. Maybe it's a military exclusion zone. Maybe it's an existing spatial-based fisheries management tool, something like essential fish habitat or cow cod conservation area that is not a formal MPA, but still may have biodiversity benefits. So much like sanctuaries, we're saying, well, we're not sure that these count or all of these areas count right now, but we need further investigation. We need to figure out what are all these areas that should be on the table for discussion. What are they doing? What kinds of access do they provide? What do they restrict? And what might their conservation benefits be? Again, we're in very early stages of exploring this question. I'll get to next steps in a little bit, but essentially we want to put together an inventory of where all these areas are, get public comment on that inventory to make sure we haven't missed anything, and then think through a science-based evaluation also with public input of, okay, do some of these areas meet the definition of conservation that's in Pathways? So I want to be really, really clear that we have these 4 approaches to achieving 30 by 30 in the coast and ocean. And we're really excited about them, and we feel it's very much consistent with the spirit of Pathways. Again, that's not top down, but is more about protecting biodiversity based on what's important to local communities, more of that bottom up working together approach. So I'm going to move on. In that spirit, OPC is part of the 30 by 30 partnership, which is a coalition that's bringing together a bunch of different folks from across the state, local, state, federal, tribal leaders to just share progress, again, because 30 by 30 is very locally and regionally driven. Achievements, new land acquisitions, tribal land returns, new progress on those protections we're looking for in the ocean, just to get together and share all those updates, exchange knowledge, and hopefully learn from one another. Our director, Deputy Secretary Jen Eckerly, is on the 30 by 30 Partnership Coordinating Committee. And so she's playing that really important role of, we're having all these conversations with the ocean community. We will be having a lot more. It's going to accelerate as this effort moves forward. How do we, bring those conversations back to this bigger 30 by 30 forum and share out what's happening and what's important to our coastal communities. A little bit more detail on the coast and ocean community outreach specifically. So as I said, we're committed to tribal partnerships, and we'll be starting tribal consultations and listening sessions on the coastal component of 30 by 30 in the coming weeks and months. We're very committed to collaboration with our sister agencies. We're having conversations with Department of Fish and Wildlife, Coastal Commission, Fish and Game Commission, because even though OPC is charged with setting the policy direction for 30 by 30, we can't do it alone. And we especially need the input of those agencies that are responsible for fisheries management, both at the state level and the federal level. And then, of course, engaging with communities. We want to engage with communities that have been historically burdened by environmental injustices and see how the 30 by 30 initiative can bring benefits to those communities. We want to have conversations with both conservation organizations who've been advocating for more restrictions on fishing, and fishing communities who are saying, hey, let's also look at the other threats to biodiversity in the ocean. It's really important to us to be talking to both of those communities. And then also access, right? A big part of the 30 by 30 initiative is saying, hey, separating humans from nature, historically hasn't been a good idea. That's not how we want to approach conservation in California. How do we support access? How do we support sustainable use? How do we make sure that people and nature can thrive together? Because that's one of the goals, the main 3 goals of that executive order that I talked about at the beginning. So next steps. I mentioned tribal consultations and listening sessions are going to start. That's key. We have been hosting some virtual topical workshops to dive into some of these issues. So we hosted one just last week on that OECM piece. We called it Conservation Beyond MPAs. So really drilling into where are these other areas? What biodiversity benefits might they provide? And I thought that was a really cool discussion. And then the next workshop is going to be next month at the end of April, focused on the National Marine Sanctuary piece. And we're going to have a guest speaker, superintendent of the Greater Fairlands and Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuary, Maria Brown. She's going to talk a little bit more about how that sanctuary is updating their management plan. And we'll talk about how we can, scooched ahead by one slide, how we can sort of work together that management plan, providing such a cool opportunity to strengthen some biodiversity protections, again, based on top threats in that sanctuary. We drafted up a whole list of priority science needs related to 30 by 30, and it's Pathways Appendix E, I believe. It's a big list and it's pretty comprehensive, so we need to kind of prioritize that list and think about what research gaps are there that we really need to fund and support in the next couple of years. And then, of course, continued community outreach. I mean, I think that there's been, to be candid, I think there's been confusion among California's coastal communities about where are we in this 30 by 30 effort? Like, are things already starting to get designated? The decadal management review of MPAs is happening at the same time. I think that's kind of contributed to some of the confusion. So we want to be really clear that we're at the beginning of this process. And so as we go forward, we're going to be having these virtual workshops. Jen and I are going to go to some fishing shows, for example, and talk to some fishermen about issues that they've been bringing up. We want to get out into coastal communities and talk to those conservation organizations, talk to EJ organizations, and really lay out those 4 approaches, continue to get feedback. So as we move forward, we're really doing this in good and earnest partnership with communities. So I will wrap there. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I also really appreciate Coastal Quest's emphasis on exploring how local projects can contribute to 30 by 30, because again, I think that's really consistent with how we're approaching this in California. My contact info is up there. I'll drop it in the chat. We also have a 30 by 30 email address that all of your, if you don't want to email me directly, all 30 by 30 inquiries can go there as well. And we have a 30 by 30 website that we're starting to build out with answers to a lot of the most frequently asked questions and opportunities to get involved. Great. So I'll stop there. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks everyone for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you, Lauren, for your great presentations. We're now going to start the Q&A discussion part of the panel. So I think, Sadie, you're going to launch the Q&A piece. So if you have questions that you'd like to ask Lauren or Michael, please type them in the Q&A window on Zoom that's located at the bottom of your Zoom application, and we will answer some of those. And while we're waiting for some of the participants to ask some questions, I have a question that I'm going to ask Lauren and Michael. And Lauren and Michael, I do invite you to look at the open Q&A, and if there's a question that you would like to answer, please do so. But my first question for both of you is, there's a lot of funding and emphasis on coastal adaptation and resilience. At the same time as this opportunity around coastal 30 by 30. And so I just wanted to hear from both of you kind of what are the tools and opportunities that could kind of, really be promoting both of those goals that people should be considering as they move forward in promoting coastal 30 by 30. Do you have any ideas or thoughts on that to share with the group? Lauren, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. Yeah, I think it's incredibly important to look at these multiple benefits that protected areas and conserved areas can provide. And certainly, I think that one of the big gorillas in the room, right, is climate change. And so we need to be thinking about how can we design and manage these areas for long-term sustainability and adaptability. And I think there are a lot of tools out there to do it. NOAA is a science agency and has a lot of great climate data. And so we definitely want to assist local organizations in including that information and also tools to kind of walk through that process of identifying what are some of the most likely threats to the areas that you're trying to conserve or the resources you're trying to conserve, and what sorts of adaptation options are there. I think generally, globally, we're at the beginning of that adaptation process. It's happened a little bit more quickly on land, but we are starting to get some really good experience in the ocean and in the coastal zone about actions we can take. And I think this idea of establishing communities of practice, as Coastal Quest is doing and as the state of California is doing, and efforts that the federal agencies are doing, is really important to kind of pool our knowledge and learn from each other.
Great, thanks. Michael, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, and I can jump on. I agree with everything that Lauren said. I think for us, it's kind of just a question of applying that at the state level. So I think whether you're talking about, adaptive management of the NPA network, working with federal managers on strengthening protections in national marine sanctuaries, like we want new, like let's just take national marine sanctuaries, for example, right? We would want those strengthened protections to be climate resilient, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this actually kind of leads into a question I see in the Q&A from Steve about how that durability fits with that definition, the element of the definition that focuses on durability fits with adaptive management. Like it could kind of seem like those two things are in conflict, but they're not. For us, durability just means like these areas aren't subject to simple reversal. So there's some process in place to change, let's say, the NPA network, right? So adaptively managing the NPA network is really important. We want to make sure if there's evidence that says like this NPA isn't functioning as it should, we might need to change a boundary or a regulation, like that there's a pathway for those kind of tweaks to the NPA network, but that they're not like, no one's going to be able to just simply like wipe them off the map, without a public process, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you. So another question I have before we go over to the Q&A is, how is NOAA and OPC sharing information? I mean, Michael, you said you're launching a website. There's a couple other websites. Maybe you guys can just put some of that information in the chats. But even, learning about a webinar in the future, are there some listservs or other ways that things are being announced? And particularly, there's, both organizations are leading funding, and there is this commitment for Justice 40 goals, and just wanting to hear from both of you, like how are priority communities and how is NOAA and OPC kind of thinking about ensuring that there's a meeting of some of those goals around the funding distribution?
Yeah, I can start, and then Lauren, please jump in from your side. But OPC does fund a lot of coastal work. We fund a lot of research, but we also fund a lot of community-oriented, multi-benefit projects. And I think a lot of that work, like I mentioned, we've been very focused on the science needs right now, but there are also community needs that are equally important for helping us get to 30 by 30. So, and a lot of that, the work kind of has to take place within these existing lines on a map, right, to count for 30 by 30. But Pathways talks about this whole conservation matrix, that it's really not just about counting to 30, right? We have to get there, but it's more about like, what is the good work that we're getting done to conserve coastal and ocean biodiversity in the state for OPC. So we definitely want to see more, community justice oriented projects. One really cool example of that, just in, I guess it was last year, OPC supported the return of 46 acres of coastal land to the Wiyot tribe. It's culturally significant land, it's coastal, and that area now counts for 30 by 30 because it's going to be stewarded by the tribe for ecological, but also cultural restoration. So not just about restoring the nature, but restoring those cultural practices that the tribes have been disconnected from. So that's the kind of, that's an example, I think, of some of the work that OPC really wants to fund.
Lauren, anything from the federal perspective you'd like to share?
Just maybe to put in a plug for the Friday session that you all are hosting,
Yeah.
where you're going to get more into detail on funding opportunities. There is a historic opportunity with bipartisan infrastructure law and the IRA. A lot of funding going out the door, and a considerable amount of that funding earmarked for tribes and specific criteria for underserved communities. So I think there's some great opportunities there. And I would just say there's also, I'll find it and put it in the chat, a website. I put the one in there for NOAA on America the Beautiful, just to keep up with what's happening there. But there's also a website on the funding opportunities that I can put in the chat as well.
Great, thank you. So we have quite a few questions from the audience. I'm going to turn to that list of questions here. Lauren and Michael, if you see one that you'd like to answer, just let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to pick one. We have a question, Michael, from David, asks you to speak a little bit more about the indigenous marine stewardship areas and how this is going to work.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'll be really candid and say that this is an idea that came from conversations we've been having with tribal partners about, hey, these, MPAs, sanctuaries, some of these existing spatial management measures for fisheries, water quality protected areas, like that's all great. But what about areas that tribes have been stewarding since time immemorial? And at the Resources Agency, since we were putting this document together in consultation with tribes, we felt like, hey, that's really, really important to include. So there needs to be a pathway for conserving coastal waters where that tribal stewardship can be recognized. And indigenous marine stewardship areas is how we've termed it in the pathways document. But in terms of figuring out what that looks like, we are still at step zero, essentially. So we don't know what it'll look like in practice, but we know that we have to start talking to tribes and saying, how do you want this to look? And maybe it doesn't look the same all across the board, because there's such a diversity of tribal stewardship and capacity to take on certain things. So it might not have to be one, designation across the state. We'll just have to see how it unfolds.
Lauren, we have a question from Michelle about the status of the atlas and what opportunities there will be to provide information and how to learn about that. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, I can say a little bit about that. So there have been some really good public comment opportunities. We got a ton of public comment about what people wanted to see in the atlas, which is basically the federal version of some of the work that California has done about what counts, where is it, what kinds of conservation benefits is it providing. And so I think the goal is sometime later this spring to have a beta version of the atlas available. It is definitely going to be a work in progress, so it's going to be improved over time. And I think we're going to be looking for feedback from the public and from groups who are working on the ground about how we can make it more useful. There is a plan to create a website called conservation.gov that will also have an initial launch and be built out over time. But the idea is to really have that site be a matchmaker between different kinds of needs, like I'm looking for funding or I'm looking for technical assistance, and help people identify resources that they need. So I think those two opportunities should be really helpful.
Great, thank you. And I see, Michael, maybe you were starting to answer a question from Jim, but I was also thinking about it. I'd love to hear more from Lauren, but also you, Michael, when you brought up that map of California and all the green on the land, and then all the coastal waters, but wasn't seeing a lot of green on the coast and on the watersheds. And so Jim's question kind of speaks to that, and it was also on my mind. What is the plan around protecting rivers and streams and watersheds, and that the connection between land and sea and coastal waters? And is that being addressed specifically from either of the programs? And maybe just kind of expand upon that.
Yeah. So, just for the purposes of counting to 30, there's land side, right, which is mean high tide line shoreward, and then there is the coastal water side, which is mean high tide line out 3 nautical miles to sea, right? But that's a little bit of an arbitrary distinction because we know the land and the ocean are connected. So I think like focusing on that land-sea connection and thinking about, what kind of land-based protections, especially in watersheds, can help improve ocean health. That's really important. I think that'll come out a lot in the maybe in the OECM discussion, certainly in the sanctuary space, because I think there's a lot of room for, water quality issues, for example, right? How is river and stream health impacting coastal estuary and nearshore coastal environment health? And rivers and streams specifically would be covered obviously as part of that land side. So we're not directly working on those, but in terms of coordinating with the fresh folk and the salty folk, we're constantly talking.
Great. Lauren?
Yeah, I would just add that we know that freshwater biodiversity is one of the most threatened ecosystems. So it definitely needs our support. And I think one of the great opportunities through forums like this is to make sure that we are connecting the dots between the offshore and the near shore, the coastal and the upstream. And I think projects can also do that by helping to identify, those linkages.
Right. Great. And there's a couple questions in the chat that talk about different types of ownership. Kevin asked a question about different types of ownership, private lands, and someone else above was talking about IUCN's, support of projects that are privately owned in Africa, and gave an example. And I was just curious to hear about how, what are the thoughts of leveraging some of these different types of ownership structures to count for 30 by 30 and support those efforts?
I'll start and then Michael, please add, but I did draft a quick response to that question, just saying, in general, US waters are public, and so they're not privately held. There are, of course, people who get leases for aquaculture or do certain activities. And so it's really important, I think, to work with those folks in terms of how can we pursue conservation outcomes. And another area that I think plays into this is the rights of Indigenous peoples in terms of their uses and harvest areas. And so, and the opportunity that California has identified and is also part of the global strategy to recognize Indigenous protected areas. And I think that's incredibly important and exciting to start pursuing, how can we work with Indigenous partners to support their efforts on stewardship. So I think we need to look broadly at issues of governance and use and rights as we look at these strategies.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, for us, private ownership is not much of an issue because the oceans are obviously a public trust resource. So, there's a pathway, and the pathways document focused on voluntary conservation easements. Like that's very much a land side of the equation. But Kevin brings up a good point that estuaries are kind of a special case. So I think a lot of the, hopefully, I saw also there was a question about the National Estuarine Research Reserves and whether those count as part of the 16% that we've said is already kind of our floor for conserved. Not yet. So that 16% is only right now, I want to be clear, right now, our state's marine protected area network. But any the NARS, the National Estuarine Research Reserves, are going to be part of that OECM discussion. And I think there are other, like Kevin brought up, other estuary management tools that can be part of that discussion as well. Yeah, and again, like that's a key place where that land-sea connection comes together, right? So if there are, ways to work with private landowners to help conservation on land that impacts estuary health, like OPC wants to be in that conversation for sure.
Interesting. Great. Thank you for that. So I have a question about, California's on a border. We have border in Mexico and North Canada with a lot of transboundary issues that are on coastlines, whitewater to blue water. What are some of the ways you're coordinating on some of these transboundary kind of issues that affect the coast for 30 by 30? Any?
Well, we haven't really gotten into that yet, and I think it's a really interesting question. So thanks for raising it. I think that's something that I'd love to, kind of take back to my leadership and say, hey, let's think about this. I mean, we know there's issues at the, the southern
You wanna?
border, water quality. Yep,
Mhm.
exactly. We know our neighbors to the north in Canada are interested in an MPA network. There was just that big announcement at Impact 5, pretty strong Indigenous engagement there as well. So how do we, animals don't recognize boundaries, right? And so
Yeah.
I think that transboundary coordination is super, super important. It's just not something we've really been
Right.
thinking about yet.
Great. Well, we
Yeah.
do have a funder on Friday, a shameless plug here, who started a binational coastal resilience fund. So we can, with California and Mexico. So that can help think through some of those questions. Lauren?
Yeah, I was just going to say, we have been doing quite a lot of international work on MPAs, and I think there's great opportunity, both in terms of direct ecological connections for species and habitats that are connected across North America. There's the Commission for Environmental Cooperation that's been working a lot on climate resilience for protected areas, but also just learning networks. We know that Canada has been just doing a lot of great work with their Indigenous communities. Granted, their governance is a little different, but there's a tremendous amount we can learn from them, and similarly with other countries. So I think it's a great opportunity to look at these existing partnerships and networks.
Right. Great. So maybe we can have another webinar session where we can bring in some other models from other places. That would be fun. Is there a question either of you see that you'd like to answer? Otherwise, I'm going to tap another maybe final question.
Yeah, I got one that I think Lauren and I can tag team here. So 2 questions.
Okay.
First of all, from Katie, if durability and biodiversity protection, so those 2 elements of the state's definition, determine that a land qualifies under 30 by 30, how do you quantify or determine that like, how do you make that determination, right? Does it count or not? And then Ron has asked, does our state definition of conserved match the national definition of conserved? Are we aligned? And I have thoughts, but I want to bring Lauren into that conversation, obviously. So first of all, for OPC, well, I'll just say for CNRA, on land, there are those protected area codes that match really, really well with the definition of conservation. So on land, it's I don't want to say it's easy, but it's more straightforward to say, hey, there's a land acquisition. This local conservancy purchased some land. It's going to be stewarded, protected in X, Y, and Z ways. Its code, its protected area code is GAP 1 or 2. Boom, it counts, right? So it's easier to have that objective benchmark, that metric of how we're interpreting the definition. It gets a little squishier in coastal waters because there isn't that same equivalent of a GAP code for protected areas in coastal waters. So that's why OPC has had to be a little bit more flexible in saying, okay, how do we interpret this definition? For NPAs, we definitely see durability. We also have early, they're established in statute to be managed for protecting biodiversity. And we're already seeing monitoring results are complicated, but there are positive results for biodiversity that NPAs are protecting or helping to protect ocean health in that way. So that's why the state felt comfortable saying, okay, these areas, yes, conserved. But now we need to kind of be a little bit more case by case. What do these individual sanctuaries protect and how can we strengthen them? What are these individual OECMs doing? Some may count, some may not. So I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but it's got to be a little bit more flexible. And I actually think that flexibility gives us the opportunity to take more of a threat-based approach and say, okay, well, here's what we're seeing as the biggest threats to biodiversity in this sanctuary. Maybe it's kelp loss, right? So we really want to focus on restoration. Maybe it's water quality. Gives us a little bit more flexibility in interpretation. And then Lauren, I want to hear what you have to say about kind of the national definition, because I do feel like we're aligned generally, but I also know that California is being a little bit stricter. I think that the national effort will count national marine sanctuaries even without strengthened protections of some kind. So yeah, thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I will say that I think in terms of the language, it's very much aligned. It's around durability and conservation outcomes. And then the question becomes, how do we define those terms? Like, what does durable mean and what does conservation outcome mean? And so we're starting to dig into this, and we don't have anything that's out there. We haven't we haven't kind of come out with our first cut. That's going to come out in the Conservation Atlas later this spring. But I will say that, we do maintain an MPA inventory. The MPA Center actually maintains that, of areas that meet the IUCN definition of what is a protected area. And according to that, for protected, which is typically considered to be more narrow than conserved, we are counting 26% of US waters as in a marine protected area. And in the MPA inventory, we are counting all the national marine sanctuaries. So you're right about that. I think, it might be that through the interagency process, they might take another look at that. That hasn't been determined yet, but that's where we are right now, is kind of, we have the MPA inventory as one step, and then we need to figure out how does that translate into this conserved definition.
Yeah, and I want to be really clear too on sanctuaries, that the state has not said sanctuaries don't count. We've said we want to take a closer look, because there are sort of these baseline regulations that apply across all sanctuaries, seabed alteration, discharge, right? But also each sanctuary has individual regulations that are specific to that sanctuary. They also have voluntary programs. They have, I keep coming back to restoration because I'm on the Farallones Advisory Council, and we talk a lot about kelp restoration, right? So each sanctuary is pretty unique in how they're conserving biodiversity. So we've not said they don't count. We've said we're not counting them yet. We want to take a closer look. And what a cool opportunity to join forces and get some good work done in these big places that can help us get points on the board for 30 by 30.
Yeah, and I'll just add, Michael, I think your point is exactly the one that I was making earlier. I think America the Beautiful is this great opportunity to bring together the different managers and community partners and say, how can we get more conservation? How can we get more people involved? How can we improve our management? How can we connect the dots better? How can we make sure our species are better prepared for climate changes? And I think that takes bringing all those people to the table.
Great. Well, thank you, Lauren and Michael, for great presentations and discussions this morning. And thank you, attendees, for your great questions. Sorry we can't answer them all. There's still a lot of wonderful questions out there, but we will have a transcript and the notes of those questions and answers, as well as the recording for those of you who want to look at some of those questions. I know I got a chat about that. And we will wrap up this panel now. So thank you. And I'm now going to hand it over to Tina Lee to introduce our next panel. So thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Tegan. I'm Tina. I'm a director at Coastal Quest, and I'm very excited to introduce our next set of panelists that will be sharing case studies of coastal 30 by 30 projects. Our speakers come from across the country, from Rhode Island to Puerto Rico, California and Hawaii, and will be presenting on their multi-benefit coastal projects that benefit ecosystems, local communities, and serve critical roles in building coastal resilience. So our first speaker is Mary Schoell from the Narrangansett Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, and she is based in Rhode Island. And then we'll hear from Doug Harper, who is the executive director of Malama Maunalua on the island of Oahu. And we'll hear from Gabby Polo. She's a director with Coastal Quest, based here in Oakland, California. And our last speaker is Dr. Robert Mayer, who is the director of Vida Marina at the University of Puerto Rico. After all four presentations, we'll have a Q&A and discussion with the panelists. So we'll open up the Zoom Q&A box again for you to ask your questions, which means that if a question comes up while they're presenting, write it down, don't forget it. We could share it with the speakers during our Q&A period. So without further delay, Mary, can I ask you to turn your camera back on? I will hand it over to you and let you share your screen as well.
Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. My name is Mary Schoell, and I work as a project coordinator with the Narrangansett Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve in Rhode Island. I'm really honored to be here today to share a little bit about a collaborative project I've been a part of that was recently funded by the NIFWF America the Beautiful Challenge funding, and it's titled Pathways to Resilience, Ensuring a Future for Coastal Wetlands. So our habitats of interest for this grant are coastal wetlands, which can encompass salt, brackish, and fresh tidal wetlands, and also include mangroves and vegetated shallows. But to protect the future of these habitats, we really wanted to focus on the upland habitat adjacent to coastal wetlands, because as sea level rise rates increase, our coastal wetlands and the species that depend on them face this existential challenge, right? So they'll either need to build up their elevation in place, migrate inland whenever conditions are favorable, or they'll disappear. So it's been widely recognized that protecting migration pathways wherever feasible is an important resilience strategy for the long-term survival of wetlands. But we know this is really easier said than done, as we see a lot of development along the coast and conditions might not be favorable for wetland migration. The protection of migration pathways is in many ways a conservation strategy and really an important consideration when we're thinking about conservation priorities for achieving 30 by 30 goals. Migration pathway protection also requires working and communicating across geographic and organizational sectors and scales. So altogether, this topic was really ripe for the America the Beautiful Challenge funding opportunity. And this opportunity has been established to conserve, connect, and restore the lands, waters, and wildlife upon which we all depend. So we applied to this grant on behalf of 6 reserves in the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. And it's important here to understand that the reserve system is really this framework that's designed to tackle locally relevant, nationally significant coastal challenges. So the NERS is a network of 30 protected coastal and estuarine areas throughout the US, as we've already heard today. But each reserve is a partnership between NOAA and a state agency or university. And reserves are really these living laboratories where scientists and stakeholders work together to actively inform coastal management through different sectors at the reserves. They conserve and steward coastal and estuarine habitats. They research and monitor these habitats and the species that they support. And each site is engaged in really understanding local community needs and building networks with coastal partners and providing technical assistance and training. So the reserve system is really no stranger to the vulnerability of coastal habitats and wetland loss. And we've been focusing on coastal wetland resilience for a number of years now through different geospatial assessments, research, and needs assessments. And so more recent assessments that highlighted the need for this system to advance its work on coastal wetland migration is really what drove us to write this proposal, since we learned that reserves and their partners really want to protect migration pathways, but lacked centralized funding, capacity, data, and expertise to work really specifically on this resilience strategy. So here we did the pre-work. We had a small team of us that wanted to meet these needs for the system. And we started reaching out to all reserves to see who wanted to be part of this application cycle. So we applied to the planning grant category of funds. And overall, I just wanted to highlight that our project goal is to build local and regional capacity to protect tidal wetland migration pathways at a significant scale in coastal settings. And so to do this, reserves will be leading collaborative processes to assist communities with decision-making about wetland migration pathway planning and eventually, hopefully, ultimately protection. And they'll also provide science-based information in the form of geospatial data that's been vetted by these local partners through this process. So our project scope is really best described through this framework that outlines a continuum of stages and activities that advance the protection of migration pathways and ultimately lead to on-the-ground restoration or acquisition projects. So again, through their place-based design, reserves are really well positioned to establish a committed network of partners and build consensus. And many reserves are already doing this. So this funding really provides support to reserves at these different stages of collaborative planning, partner strategizing, mapping, and project identification, with the ultimate goal of moving reserves along this spectrum to stage 4 to be able to implement projects that could be supported by future years of either America the Beautiful funding or other infrastructure funding. And you'll also see that the yellow oval explains that participating reserves will also collaborate to accelerate learning and implementation. So information and lessons learned from each stage will be really leveraged and transferred to support all reserves and their partners who might be at different stages or in different geographies. So these are the 6 reserves that are funded through this grant, and all are completing different stages, like I said, of activities. And we'll be working at different geographic scales that are well beyond the reserve boundaries. And you can really get a sense of this in the map on the right, which was part of our submission process. The Narragansett Bay Reserve, where I'm located in Rhode Island, was the lead applicant on this proposal. And I also just wanted to add that a portion of funds will be used to fund NOAA's Office for Coastal Management with providing some geospatial mapping and modeling support to a few of the reserves that indicated this interest. This project has multiple short and long-term benefits that really hit on America the Beautiful and 30 by 30 priorities, which we've been discussing. And I think these really led to this proposal's success. So multiple benefits here would be engaging local communities, strengthening ecosystem and community resilience by providing flood protection benefits and buffering human communities from storm surge damage. In the long term, this work will ultimately expand habitat connectivity between estuaries and their upland habitats, benefit at-risk fish, wildlife, and plant species, provide a range of ecosystem services, that wetlands and future wetlands provide, such as nursery habitat, flood storage, nutrient processing, and they'll also expand public and community access to nature, where these conserved featured landscapes can provide opportunities for passive recreation. And just to scale down to an example of what we'll be doing in Rhode Island as a result of this funding, I just wanted to share, for our state, we have updated SLAM maps, and we also have a salt marsh migration coastal parcel planning tool. And so through the duration of this grant, we'll be working with local land trusts and planners across the state to really be able to use and implement this tool to identify priority acquisition or protection opportunities that we could go after in future years. And so that's what we'll be using our funding for in the state of Rhode Island. The funds haven't landed yet, but we're deeply excited to get started on this. And I know our network of partners is also very excited. So I'll stop there. Thanks so much. And I'd be happy to answer any questions about the process or about our future work. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mary, for your presentation. And now I'd like to introduce Doug Harper, who's the Executive Director of Malama Maunalua. Hi, Doug. I'll let you share your presentation. Thanks.
Great. Let's see if I can do this. All right, just a second. All right. Well, hello, hi, everyone. As was mentioned, my name is Doug Harper. I'm the Executive Director at Malama Maunalua, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that launched here a couple of years ago, but is really starting to pick up steam for ahupua'a management in the Bay. And if you're not familiar with the Hawaiian concept of ahupua'a, it's basically a traditional delineation of land that's very similar to a watershed as we would understand it. And if you aren't familiar with the organization, Malama Maunalua, we were founded in 2005 to restore the health of Maunalua Bay, which is the area down the yellow box in the lower left. It's one of the largest bays in the state. And if you're wildly unfamiliar with Hawaii, this is the island of Oahu. Just to the left of that yellow box is where you would find Waikiki. And so the area that I'm talking about is one of the largest bays in the state. It's also one of the most heavily impacted. In the 1930s and 40s, you saw significant migration and development taking place into the area. And so today you see 60,000 people that live there. We have a huge tourist influx every year. There's about 10 shopping centers. Roughly 90% of the nearshore area is paved or impervious. The forests that are left in the area, some of them have upwards of 80% invasive species. All of the streams in the area are cemented and channelized. And as mentioned, there's a huge utilization of the area by residents and tourists alike for fishing and boating and whatnot. And what that led to was a fairly significant degradation of the bay itself, which is why my organization was founded. You don't need to get out your jeweler's eye to look at this. I'll just point at colors and you can and explain them a little bit. But all of that development, all of that use led to Maunalua Bay having some of the lowest fish biomass in the state. And that's the bar graph on the right, were the blue bars at the far left of the graph. We had some of the highest invasive alien algae in the state, and that's the top middle one. All that red is heavy invasive algae prevalence. The far left, the kind of pastel, is coral cover. And in surveys done by NOAA, Nature Conservancy, and Maunalua, we have found that the coral cover is much lower than you would expect given oceanographic conditions. And then finally, down the lower left, we did one of the largest water quality surveys in the state. Over 200 of the 200 samples, roughly, we took, 99% of them had glyphosate. We found ibuprofen in 21% of the samples, turbidity, sediments, E. coli. It was basically a stew of problems, so to speak, for Maunalua Bay. And historically, what the organization has done is we kind of pick off projects little by little as we go through. And so we have a large Huki program that does invasive alien algae removal. We've removed 4 million pounds of it since we started in 2010. But what was happening was we were going after these projects in kind of a piecemeal way, as there were $10,000 to $50,000 grants. And we weren't necessarily taking everything as a whole and trying to do big strides in restoring the health of the bay through partnerships with our other organizations. And so a couple of years ago, we started working a lot more closely with some of the organizations that are working in the terrestrial side. And we sought funding through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation Resilience Grant. And what this was we went in with the forest restoration folks. We went in for ways with engineers to see if we can redesign the stream. We went in for green infrastructure installation. And then I have coral planting in there because that was a project that we were doing already, that we tied this into the organization or into the overall HUI or working group. And we went for the NIFWIF grant and were able to secure it. And so an organization like Malama Maunalua that was getting $10,000 to $50,000 grants every year, we just recently got a $1.5 million grant from NIFWIF to do this. And what it meant was each of these organizations that were somewhat siloed and working in just forestry or just green infrastructure were now able to stop competing with each other and really kind of focus all our efforts around this idea of ahupua'a management, which is ridge to reef or watershed management. And the benefits that have come from this that hit on a lot of the 30 by 30 is ungulate removal. So there's a major issue with pigs and goats in the area. And so we're fencing off the areas to help with the native plant reforestation. There's a massive amount of community engagement that's taking place. So the green infrastructure effort that I mentioned is actually working with homeowners, working with commercial properties, working with the largest hotel in the area to see what they can do to help capture some of the runoff coming from their land. We're doing stream restoration. So we're working with engineers to see how we can redesign the streams that either are paved and are there ways that we can do offshoots to try and capture some of the pollution coming down, but also the only unpaved stream, what can we do there to create more native habitat for freshwater species? And then overall, really creating a stronger partnership and reducing the runoff and reducing some of the impacts both on the bay, but then what's taking place terrestrially. And the benefits aside from the habitat ecological is that as a HUI or working group, we can now go for much larger grants. So since we've secured the NIFWIF, we've now gone for a number of grants that are up in the $6, $7, $8 million range, which for a lot of organizations isn't huge, but when you're talking about a single bay on Oahu, that does allow us to go for bigger benefits, bigger projects. And really why that is, in part, is we can go for stuff that is now resilience-based. So when you talk about coral, you can talk about the the benefits they provide for wave dampening and resilience of the community that lives on land. And so then we can bring in the water quality component. We can bring in reforestation and go for grants that may be more focused on coral restoration, but then tie it back to terrestrial and vice versa. So the reforestation folks can still go for their grants as part of this larger HUI, but then funding comes out to the rest of the group that helps us with the restoration. And so that was a very quick 7 minutes, but I would be happy to answer any questions that folks may have. And I want to thank you for listening. Mahalo.
Thank you, Doug. And yes, if you have any questions for Doug or Mary, write them down. We'll address them in the Q&A section. I'd like to introduce Gabby Polo, who's a director at Coastal Quest. And Gabby, if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Tina. And hello, everyone. I'm Gabby Polo. I'm a director at Coastal Quest, as Tina just mentioned, and I lead our water quality work in partnership with California's water boards for the organization. And I'm really excited to join this discussion on multi-benefit coastal 30 by 30 solutions and bring you an example of some of the work that Coastal Quest is supporting and piloting in California's Central Coast and how this can contribute to 30 by 30 goals. So first, I wanted to provide some insight into how this work came to be. In 2020, Coastal Quest conducted this landscape assessment to identify some of the current and future on-the-ground opportunities and needs that could help restore, improve, and protect the water quality and the environments in California's coastal waters and marine ecosystems. And this assessment revealed opportunities for partnership with California's water boards to create a statewide coastal water quality initiative that would identify some emerging threats to coastal water quality, pilot projects to test out some solutions, and also build a blueprint for scale in other geographies. And for context, the water boards in California is a collective name for California State Water Resource Control Board and the 9 regional water quality control boards, which have the mandate in California to enhance and restore the quality of the state's water resources and to allocate surface water rights for the benefit of future and present generations. And does Coastal Quest explore which opportunities to pursue? The design and implementation of pilot projects to test approaches focused on state water quality protection areas rose as a priority, especially as in 2020, California committed to protecting 30% of its coastal waters and lands by 2030. So the water boards can nominate and designate state water quality protection areas in California to prevent the undesirable alteration of natural water quality in areas of the ocean that support unique marine life. So in 2022, we were able to receive some settlement funds as well as some private dollars to formally launch this effort. But before jumping into the pilot that we are advancing, I wanted to share a little bit more about water quality protection areas. There's 2 types of water quality protection areas in the state, and these include general protection areas and areas of special biological significance, or ASBSs for short. So California currently has a network of 34 ASBSs that support unique and high value aquatic life and important coastal and marine habitats. So the State Water Resource Control Board established this network back in 1974 to help protect and maintain natural water quality within some of the most pristine and biologically unique sections of the California coast. And ASBS support an unusual variety of marine life and also feature unique geology that contributes to the rich biodiversity. They also serve as building blocks for cleaning and maintaining ocean water quality, acting not only as sanctuaries for wildlife and species, but also as popular destinations for divers, fishers, whale watchers, and nature lovers. And it's important to note that to maintain this level of water quality that's high enough to protect the valuable and fragile species within ASBSs, the State Water Resource Control Board prohibits any wastewater discharges into these areas. So when managed and enforced properly, water quality protection areas like ASBSs can bring multiple benefits for people, nature, and climate. And in California, a state where over 26 million people live within an hour's drive of the coast and where more than 10 billion is spent annually on beach recreation, Water quality is essential to the health of coastal waters, of our beaches, and our people. So maintaining clean ocean waters through ASBS provides, for instance, high quality environments for marine species so they can reproduce and flourish, and this helps maintain healthy fisheries, which then benefits fishers and seafood consumers. Also by supporting healthy marine habitats and organisms from large marine mammals to kelp forests and rocky reefs, ASBSs are also contributing to climate resilience as these ecosystems can sequester carbon and protect our coast against climate hazards. ASBSs are also important for research on marine life, as well as on the impacts of water quality. And in fact, marine scientists have discovered multiple species in California's ASBS network throughout the years, many unique to these areas. And furthermore, healthy ocean waters are critical for human health. So we're swimming, we're recreating along our coast, we eat the seafood, fish, and farm in these waters. So pollution can directly threaten our well-being. And finally, there's the economic benefits that this brings. As by supporting healthy oceans and coast, ASBSs really help underpin a $1 billion coastal economy in the state of California. But despite their multiple benefits, no new water quality protection areas like ASBSs have been established since 1974. And the enforcement and management of these areas also continues to be an area for growth. So as California is kicking off its 30 by 30 movement, we can leverage an opportunity to not only strengthen the enforcement and management of existing ASBSs, but also to expand the state's network of ASBSs and other water quality protection areas as a multi-benefit solution. And as you heard from Mike, 16% of California's coastal waters are already conserved through its vast MPA network. Therefore, exploring these alternative management measures beyond MPAs that can contribute to supporting marine biodiversity and 30 by 30 is a strategy that needs to be pursued. And as you heard also when Mike spoke, it's something that California is currently exploring. So recognizing this opportunity, Coastal Quest, in partnership with the State Water Resource Control Board and the Central Coast Regional Water Board, is piloting an effort in the Central Coast to enhance and protect coastal water quality and bolster 30 by 30 efforts by identifying some of the needs, barriers, and opportunities to create new water quality protection areas and strengthen their management and their enforcement. So the first step in this pilot has been consolidating information to enable data-driven decision-making and management of current and future ASBSs and state water quality protection areas. And Coastal Quest is collaborative collating data on water quality, discharges, biodiversity, the location of MPAs, marine managed areas, and of course ASBSs, among other data points, to build a mapping tool and a geodatabase to help the water boards identify management and enforcement needs, as well as potential sites for new water quality protection areas. And while the tool that we're building for the pilot focuses on the Central Coast and is meant to be for the water board's use, Coastal Quest is currently scoping its expansion statewide, and we're exploring interest in building an interactive public-facing version of this mapping tool. In parallel, we are also working with the water boards to understand some of the needs and opportunities to expand the network of water quality protection areas, again, to improve their management, compliance, enforcement. And as a first step, we've reviewed the ASBS nomination guidelines outlined in the Water Board's Ocean Plan for California, and we drafted a memo with recommendations on how to improve their clarity and identified a need to develop additional guidance on what makes a strong nomination and a strong case for stakeholders who might be interested in advancing nominations other than the Water Board. And finally, Coastal Quest and the Water Board are beginning outreach to identify opportunities and priorities from local communities to pilot water quality protected areas and supporting new nominations in the Central Coast. So here's a sneak peek of the mapping tool that we're building, which brings the most up-to-date and comprehensive data into one place and georeferences unique data points along the coast that may have not all been mapped before, or if they're mapped, they're all in different sources, all in different places and documents. So these data points are including waste and storm water discharge locations, for instance, permitted ocean outfalls, ocean intakes, and water quality data. And then when you combine that with more traditionally available data on the location of ASBSs and NPAs, marine sanctuaries, and also biodiversity hotspots and habitat data, these mapped data really collectively become a powerful tool to inform the water board's decision making and help identify siting opportunities for new water quality protection areas. So Coastal Quest is looking forward to continuing advancing this pilot and is actually looking for funding to replicate this in other coastal areas of California. And we believe that tools like water quality protection areas are an important part of the 30 by 30 puzzle, and that they can serve as collaborative, locally done efforts that bring multiple benefits, from strengthening the economy to tackling climate change and safeguarding human health, which are all key aims, as you've heard, of the 30 by 30 and the America the Beautiful initiatives. And I hope this presentation also has given you an idea of how work in water quality, which may not be the first thing that comes to mind when you think of 30 by 30, is actually critical to achieving those goals. And finally, I hope that's provided some insight into how you can frame your work's contribution to 30 by 30. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer questions in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Gabby. And I'd like to introduce Robert Mayer with the University of Puerto Rico. Robert, if you wouldn't mind turning on your camera and sharing your presentation.
Sure. Thank you very much for this opportunity. It's going to be a pleasure talking about the work that we do here in Puerto Rico towards contributing towards the 30 by 30 goal. Can you see my full screen there?
Yep, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay. I'm a professor, a full professor at the University of Puerto Rico at Aguadilla, which is one of the 11 campuses of the public system here in Puerto Rico. I'm going to be focusing on some on-the-ground work, a lot of on-the-ground work that we do, strengthening the resilience of communities on the main island of the archipelago of Puerto Rico. And we do this by implementing nature-based techniques in order to advance the ecological restoration of coastal ecosystems. We're one of the smallest of the Greater Antilles in the Caribbean, just to give you an idea where we are located. And Puerto Rico is a very densely populated archipelago, and especially the main island, where our work focuses on. We have high population density and very concentrated development, especially along the coast. We're losing important habitats at a very alarming rate. And one of the factors has been our luck with hurricanes in the last few years. We've been impacted by monster storms like Hurricane Maria on the screen there, and we're still recovering from that. Most of our coastal ecosystems were degraded by these storms. A lot of our basin mangroves have stalled recovery and have not been restored yet. The dunes along the North Coast also suffered a beating. The dunes already had many threats, most of them anthropogenic, like ATVs, sand extraction in the past, invasive species like the iguana, and also small-scale sand extraction that still happens to this day. We have a series of random beach accesses on our primary dune along the North Coast, where we have most of our dune systems. And these are very problematic because they're inlets for storm surge and storm waves, and creating a lot of flooding on the other side of the dune. So the dunes on the north coast of the island are in a very fragile state. And these have increased the vulnerability of our coastal communities to extreme weather and other effects of climate change. And we know it's not going to get any better. So we're trying to buy time and reinforce that primary line of dunes. We have a really good team composed of full-time employees, most of which have been our students on our campus. And we also have a full staff of work study and hourly student workers, as well as community volunteers. to do the work that we're doing. We're basically using nature-based techniques such as the installation of boardwalks, just to take people away from the vegetated areas. Boardwalks were not present on our coast until we started this work with NIFWIF funding back in 2019. We have installed several boardwalks of different lengths along the North Coast, especially on breaches like this one on the main dune line. And we're combining that with the installation of what we call biomimicry matrices, which allow us to trap sand transported sand. And we have a lot of that here on the North Coast. And planting. We have many volunteers coming from all over the island and also from the mainland and also from Europe. We've had a few groups from Italy and from the UK in the last few years. So we're combining these techniques and trying to help nature restore itself, and trying to teach people how to move around these areas, because we learned the hard way that dunes and mangroves are very important for our resilience, especially on the coast. And we're almost 43 of our municipalities, we have 78 are coastal. So we depend a lot on this. So these are some before and after pictures of one of those biomimicry matrices that captured a lot of sand during our last storm event, which was Hurricane Fiona on September 28 of last year. So you can see the amount of sand that's collected by these structures without the use of heavy machinery or more invasive techniques. We involved a lot of the students. We have students from schools coming and planting after the sand starts accumulating. We're working in very underrepresented areas of the island. This is Loiza. We're working right in front of a house that would get flooded with mild storms. So we're working with the communities. The community really appreciates our work, especially after having lived through very strong storms. Here's a group of students from Suffolk University in Boston some years ago, working on the restoration of a dune that looks like this. And it's called the Finca Noya Nature Reserve. It's right in the center of the North Coast. We also have an environmental education component in collaboration with the Earth Partnership program of the University of Wisconsin in Madison. We train teachers, we train community leaders on the importance of ecological restoration, and we give them training and involve them in our on-the-ground work. We use our students, our undergrads, as education resources. This is Alvin. He's doing his master's, but he used to be a very good environmental educator. We're involved in mangrove restoration as well. We're restoring 4 mangroves with a grant from NIFWIF, from the Coastal Resilience Program. These are basin mangroves that have stalled recovery, and we're trying to restore them back on a track to their historical trajectory to full recovery. And we would like to thank NIFWIF for the funding. If it wasn't for these, the last 3 grants that we had not done what we have done, protecting some communities and also habitats along the North Coast. We have many more sites to restore, so we're constantly writing grants and submitting grants to attract funding for this effort. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Robert. And if you wouldn't mind keeping your camera on, and I'll ask the other presenters to also turn their cameras on to join us for the Q&A portion. Thank you so much for your presentations, and I really enjoyed seeing all the volunteers and the students participating in your projects, Robert. So congratulations on that, and to the other panelists for your successes. I'm going to go ahead and start with a question, but our Q&A box is open. So if you have a question for one of the panelists, feel free to drop it in there. And to the panelists, you can, if you see something you want to answer, go ahead and do it in chat, or we'll address it in the larger panel as well. So my first question is for all of you. What advice do you have for someone starting to design and plan a multi-benefit coastal project? Do you have any lessons learned that you could share now that you wish you knew at the beginning? Would anyone like to go first? Doug is smiling. Doug, can I hand it to you?
I was just smiling to see who was going to be the first one. I should have kept a poker face over that. Yeah, I think for us, what really made a big benefit right at the start was geographically defining where we wanted to work, because it helped us in identifying the key organizations that were working in the area that we could then reach out to and partner with. Had we gone for, so we ended up, I didn't mention it, working in just 3 months. I knew the dogs were going to start barking when I started speaking. We had 3 watersheds that we were focused on, and so it just made it much easier to identify who to work with. And it helps to, when you have a grant like NIFWIF that can help bring people to the table to talk together, because then you can kind of see what that goal might be at the end.
Thanks, Doug. Anyone else would like to answer that question? Robert?
We can go next. I think project planning is key and it's very important. One lesson that I've learned over the years is that things take more time than you think. And that's a very good lesson I've learned, probably the hard way. And always plan for a hurricane in this area and for a pandemic. You know, we had a reduction in the numbers of volunteers that really affected our projects. Also involve the communities and get their buy-in. Especially, we've had really good buy-in from most of the communities, except from some patches on the metro area. And these are very wealthy neighborhoods. So that was very challenging for us. And getting through to these people that you know, was very hard. And we definitely have to work on that.
Thank you. Gabby and Mary, would you like to answer this question? Mary?
Yeah, I could add something. I guess one thing we are sort of learning or wishing we did or incorporated into this proposal was to really build in enough money for each participant to be able to participate in like these larger project team meetings or system-wide, project-wide type of opportunities. So participating in work groups or other peer learning group, community of practice type things that we're planning on designing as part of this work. These are sort of extra things that require additional time outside of just doing the work that each reserve is funded to do. So, and like, you know, that's what's already been said, all these things take a lot more time than you're anticipating when you're writing a proposal. So just being mindful of the sort of extra things you're going to sign on to do.
And I can add something too, Tina.
Yeah,
Well,
please.
I would like to echo what everyone else has shared. They've touched on some very important points. And I think I also wanted to highlight the importance of rooting whatever project you're building in a needs assessment and trying to really understand what needs and gaps you're responding to. And also, I think I would like to echo Robert's point on engaging communities, engaging diverse stakeholders, which I think Doug also touched on. That's going to be really critical in creating projects with buy-in that really cater to those needs that you've identified and those priorities.
Thanks, Gabby. And so many of you mentioned that you were able to obtain NIFWIF funding or other kind of public funds that either came through the Inflation Reduction Act or IIJA. Can you speak about whether you engaged public agencies in the process of developing your projects? And if so, you know, what worked well? What is an approach that worked well? And if you'd
can
like to go
if
first,
you
yeah,
want.
go ahead,
Yeah.
Robert. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm dying to talk. So yeah, we worked closely with the Puerto Rico Department of Natural and Environmental Resources, and that has not always been easy. Right now, we're on a really good, in a really good time in the 13 years that we've been existing in ecological restoration of our coast. And even though we have had no technical support or advice from these agencies, at some point of this last 13 years, communication has been broken, and probably for political reasons, I don't know. And that was a very big hurdle for us. Just getting a permit when we had secured funds, and even though we had gotten a letter of support for the project, that took time and a lot of effort and frustration. Like I said, now we have a really good secretary and her staff is great. So I hope this lasts for a longer time, because things here politically are not always continuous. We get a lot of turnover, of different, political parties and politics, as you probably all know, when you involve politics with restoration, it sometimes doesn't work. So that's my experience right there.
Thanks, Robert. Would anyone else like to answer this question?
Mary, you go.
Oh, I mean, I could just quickly add, as I said before, the reserve system is really this federal, state, or university partnership. So that partnership is built into the design of the system, which I think made it really, sort of easy for us in that sense. But that also makes it really helpful for getting technical expertise. Like how I said, NOAA, Office for Coastal Management, will be doing a lot of the mapping and modeling work that can't be done in-house at individual reserves, since they don't always have the capacity. But reserves will also engage with other state partners or state divisions and communities and organizations through this stakeholder engagement process as part of this grant. But I guess I just wanted to emphasize that reserves have these longstanding relationships with these partners already and are also very experienced in collaborative learning and planning. So there's already this sort of existing collaborative nature to the work that's being done. So.
Yeah, and I think, we don't have a designation in the same way as a NER, but we also brought in the state and federal partners very, very early in the process. And a lot of what we did was identify what they were trying to do as an agency and say, well, we can do this portion of it, so that they saw that there was value in partnering with us. And frankly, for us, it was to help shape for permitting. Like what Robert was saying, is that permitting can be the big hurdle a lot of times. And so by us kind of coming to the table with stuff to help them out in their mission, it really helped with them wanting to step forward and help us with the permitting. And then for like technical and funding and stuff like that, we kind of viewed the government as kind of anything we get from them is gravy. Like we didn't rely on them for anything substantive to our project that we didn't have to. But if they were willing to come forward at some point, we just saw that as a bonus, because we were afraid that if we relied too much on them on some of these projects, we were just going to hit a bottleneck, because they're all got too much to do and too many spaces to do it. So it was really just we could help them with that workload.
Thanks, Doug. And for Mary and Robert, there are some questions in the Q&A box that are directed to you. I see, Robert, you're answering one of them. And Mary, there's a question about sediment depositions. And I also want to invite everyone, if you have a question for either one or all of the panelists, feel free to drop it in the Q&A box. I do have one question about community leadership. So can you speak a little bit about how the community around your project site shaped the project itself, and what messaging, what ideas did they adhere to? So Was it the multi-benefit aspect that really interested them? How did you get the community on board? And maybe I'll point to Robert and Doug, because I know that both of you did a lot of community engagement and still do. So Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, well, we have a very heterogeneous North Coast landscapes as well as socially speaking. But one of the projects that I'm more fond of is the Loiza project, and this is a very pristine area of coast, right next to the international airport in San Juan, and it's populated. It's mostly African Puerto Ricans or African Americans, descendants of freed slaves that live in that area. They have their own culture. It's a very rich area, but it's also very underrepresented. And they suffered a lot right after the storm, right after Maria in 2017. And some small populations were isolated for weeks because of the flooding. And it was one of the last places where, recovery arrived, which was very slow for the whole island, but slower in that area. And there are areas still that look like Maria hit us yesterday along that coast. A lot of erosion, and people were really scared. We used to talk to the teachers and give talks there, but the message was clear after we were hit by the storm. Everybody changed. We all have PTSD. Most of us do. Every time we hear the wind howling, even if it's like 20 miles an hour, it just brings back memories that give you chills, and people all of a sudden started supporting our work like they had never supported it before, just by that experience. And we've taken advantage of it because our message is so clear, and people respect the structures that we install. Even like flimsy little signs, they don't even touch, because they know it's going to protect them when the big storm comes. And the clock is ticking. We don't know if we're going to get a big one this season. So we're really getting through to the communities a lot better after the storms, and that's very interesting from a social perspective or psychological perspective, I think.
Robert.
Yeah, and I think to what Robert's hitting on is something that we have as well. Nowhere close to a significant storm, but really it was finding those groups and community members that we knew had specific interests. And so we had a big flood here in 2018. And so for a large swath of the community, the good thing with doing environmental restoration is it kind of has so many different benefits. You can tie it back to almost anything people are interested in. And so like when we're doing forest restoration, we're able to talk to them about how this will impact flooding in the future. And because of the floods of 2018, they were very supportive of that. And we did that with basically every group, was finding what their interest was and showing how this larger group of organizations working together were all doing things that would ultimately benefit whatever that interest was, whether it was a concern for flooding to wanting to have more fish for fishing. And so that really helped us, I think, make inroads with the communities from, basically throughout, people who are just visiting to people who lived there for generations.
Thank you, Doug. What an interesting conversation. Thank you all so much to our panelists. We are unfortunately out of time. 2 hours went very quickly, but thank you very much. And I'm just going to talk through some next steps. So this is the first of 3 webinars. On Friday, we're going to hear from NOAA and the California State Coastal Conservancy and the San Diego Foundation and Marisla Foundation about funding priorities in Coastal 30 by 30. And next Monday, we'll hear more case studies from coastal leaders on their experiences and journeys formulating these multi-benefit coastal projects, and also have an opportunity to engage in discussion with them. So a link to register is on our website and it's in the chat. And, you know, the other thing that Coastal Quest has been working on is putting together, every time we hear about a coastal funding opportunity, we'll put it in a Google Doc. And we have a coastal 30 by 30 funding opportunities list that you're more than welcome to use, visit, or if you know of something that you don't see in there, let us know and we'll add it. So we'll also send that link to the Google Doc in the chat. This session is being recorded, and we'll share the recording and notes both on our website, but also through an email to everyone who has registered at the end of the webinar session. The other thing that we're going to send to you is an evaluation, and please do fill that evaluation out. And that's going to come also at the end of the webinar series. Other than that, I want to thank you all for joining us, and also thank you very much to our speakers for sharing their experience and their insights with us today. If you have any questions, our email address is info@coastalquest.org, and hope to see you on Friday or next Monday. Thank you so much.